You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
There are four individuals on the Saving Elephants Mount Rushmore of great conservatives. Individuals I often point to as a sort of shorthand for saying, hey, when I say conservative, these are the kind of individuals I believe are emblematic of the sort of conservatism I'm trying to espouse here. I talk about them often. They are Edmund Burke, Russell Kirk, Thomas Sowell, and William F. Buckley. Now, the first three individuals, Edmund Burke, Russell Kirk, and Thomas Sowell, I have done one-off episodes with guests and deep dives into their thoughts and ideas and why they're important. I mean, anybody who's listened to me for any length of time knows I've done more than many episodes on why Edmund Burke is important. But I've never done an episode dedicated to William F. Buckley, who is just as important, in my opinion, as those other three. Because without him, we would not have the modern American conservative movement. Now, part of the reason I've not done an episode on Buckley is he's honestly kind of a difficult guy to summarize. His main contribution to conservatism was not strictly ideas, or the books or columns he had written, or I would say even the various organizations that he spearheaded, from Young America's Foundation to National Review to Firing Line. Buckley had his hand in just about everything Conservative Inc. back in the days. Back when conservatism was just a fledgling, tiny intellectual movement that could only dream of having some political power at some point. Buckley's main contribution, in my view, isn't so much what he did or wrote or what he said, but in his ability to bring together these often warring tribes within the collective right, to find a way to mold and shape them, and to give conservatism a movement, not just something that produced books and ideas for people to think about, but something that had the potential to impact the broader political scene and America at large. No one was more instrumental, no one was more gifted at this than William F. Buckley. But for that reason, he's also someone who's really hard to talk about. He's hard to distill exactly what thing did he do, what specific thing did he do that was so instrumental. It was a series of things. It was a lifetime lived. My guest in this episode is none other than Sam Tanenhaus, whose biography on William F. Buckley was published earlier this year. After many, many years of him laboring over this, it was published earlier this year. I had a great time reading it. I had a great conversation with Sam. His book is approaching 900 pages, and I think he probably, too, struggled somewhat with how exactly do you distill a life of an individual like this who just lived so large and did so many things that it's hard to just boil it down in a handful of pages. Now, Sam Tanenhaus' book, released earlier this year, is perhaps not quite coincidentally the exact same year that William F. Buckley would have turned 100 years old if he were alive today, on November the 24th. And if you're listening to this episode the day that it's dropped, that's less than a week away. Now, the day before that, November the 23rd, I'm going to do a live stream. Another one of these YouTube videos with a panel of guests to discuss the life and legacy of William F. Buckley. And if you listen to this conversation, and I think it's a good one, and you're wanting more, I'm going to approach it from a different angle. Again, that's Sunday, November the 23rd. It'll be at 7 p.m. Central Time or 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Lasts for about an hour. And it's a live stream that you're welcome to participate in. The listeners and the viewers can post comments and interact with the panelists. So since Buckley turns 100 this year, I'm trying to do him right, trying to do him some justice by having on his biographer, Sam Tanenhaus, and then having a live stream coming up here shortly. But with all that, I'm going to turn you to my conversation now with Sam Tanenhaus on William F. Buckley.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
Sam, I want to ask you about William F. Buckley's politics, of course. That's what we're here to talk about. But before we get there, since you knew Bill Buckley personally, I want you to start by describing William F. Buckley to an individual, not his politics, but just who was Buckley the man?
Bill Buckley, the man, was just a larger than life, very amusing, sharp-eyed, great listening companion. Took a while to get used to it because it was so famous. I mean, it's 1990 when I met him. He was 65, which is younger than I am now. But I was, just in my 30s. I was nobody from nowhere. And he treated me like I was someone worthy of his interest. In fact, he demonstrated interest in me, which we both know is not common when you deal with really prominent people. They're there to be on, they kind of tolerate your presence. Bill Buckley was not like that. He wanted to know what you were reading, wanted to know what you'd done the week before. He would talk about what he'd been reading, or he talked about sailing. Almost never talked about politics. And he once told me the only time he ever talked about politics is when somebody pays me to do it. And they paid him a lot. He got rich doing it.
Yes. And he, of course, he had so many interests outside of politics, from sailing to skiing to music, that it seemed like he was the sort of person that could talk to almost anyone. And I know that a lot of people who've described Buckley start off exactly as you did. They start off talking about how you were big in his eyes, right? You were seen, you were heard, that he almost radiated this attention to you that could make you feel amazing, especially, as I think that was sort of his superpower for gluing together the early days of the conservative movement. Here's this very famous celebrity who has taken time out of his day to genuinely get to know me.
Yeah, and I'll add something else, Josh. You have to remember how young Bill Buckley was when he attained celebrity. I mean, really, with his first book, God and Man at Yale, which you will have noticed is the book everybody's talking about now. Not just when they write about my book, it's showing up everywhere now. When they talk about what's going on in college campuses, they talk about Charlie Kirk. Kirk seems to have been a kind of heir of Buckley. So with that fame, Josh, it meant that when Buckley was first building his movement, a lot of the people around him were older than he was. So he was kind of a sponsor and mentor to his elders. So he was a great son in that way. The great writer Franz Kafka once said that there are two kinds of people. They're fathers and sons, two kinds of men. Buckley was both. So when I met him, I'm in my 30s, he seemed like a father figure. But when he was starting out, this flamboyant, charismatic, very funny guy, that I tried to capture that in the book, the one-liners, the humor, the wit. So it meant, when I talked to the longtime publisher of National Review, Bill Rusher, we had a very long interview about Buckley. And I got to know Bill Rusher pretty well. This was now, 20 years ago or more. And Bill Rusher was retired. Bill Buckley was still alive. Remember, I started this book when Bill Buckley obviously was very much alive. And I said to Bill Rusher, what was Bill Buckley's greatest period? When did he accomplish the most? I thought he was going to say the 1960s, because that's when Bill Buckley became most famous through Firing Line, started in 1966, his wonderful debate program. That's when he ran for mayor of New York and really transformed American politics as a kind of humorous spectacle, with many other candidates like him to follow. But that's not what Bill Rusher said. He said the 1950s, because he said that's when Bill, everyone called him Bill, including people who worked in the mailroom at National Review. That's when Bill brought together, Bill Rusher said, the lions and tigers and bears. All the different types of radicals on the right, of old style conservatives, the sort of people you yourself and some of your listeners, many of your listeners, know a good deal about. Wilmore Kendall and Frank Meyer and James Burnham and Brent Bozell, these giants of modern conservatism, all came to depend on Bill Buckley, and they gravitated toward him. Willy Schlamm, who was his co-founder of National Review, said only one man can do this. Said it's got to be Bill Buckley. Only Bill can start the magazine. Only Bill can keep us all together. Only Bill Buckley can reach the public, interface with the public in the way that a very marginal movement needed someone to do. So Bill Buckley cultivated many liberal friends. That's one reason his appointment book was a surprise to me. Not really, but just the depth of it. He gave me his personal calendar, which no one else had ever seen. I think not even his son, Christopher. And the personal calendar started in the late 1960s, when Bill Buckley was so famous, he had 2 secretaries looking after him, 2 assistants. And it went to the year 2000. And it was an appointment book. It was simply the name and event, who he was meeting for breakfast, for lunch, for dinner, what lecture he was giving, when he was meeting with his publisher. And he's juggling all these balls at once. You almost can't believe it. Taping 3 segments of Firing Line, one after another in a single day. Flying to London, to interview Margaret Thatcher, and then have breakfast 2 days later with Henry Kissinger. It's almost comical. But I knew from my experience being in Bill Buckley's company, that's how he lived his life. I mean, he did that by choice. He was not a guy who said, oh boy, I'm overbooked. I wish it wasn't, I didn't have to do so much. He was a guy who said, well, last dinner's over. Let's go for the overnight sail across Long Island Sound. It was just the way he was wired.
Yeah. You mentioned in the book, I'm not going to get the quote, I'm not going to quote it directly, but something to the effect of that, the main driving force of Buckley was not so much politics. It was almost more of a yearning or a passion to bring his friends along on what he was passionate about.
I'm so glad you picked that up because it's really, really so important. He was one of those people, we all know them, who here's an example. For much of his life, Bill Buckley, who loved classical music and played the piano and the harpsichord, had beautiful instruments in both his homes in New York and in Connecticut. Famous musicians played on them. Bill Buckley did not get popular music. Rock and roll. I'm a rock and roll guy. I don't know about you. I love rhythm and blues. I love Motown, all the stuff that my generation grew up with. He did not get until near the end of his life. He discovered Elvis Presley, 20 years or more after Elvis had died. But to Bill, it was as if nobody else had ever heard of Elvis Presley. So you got to listen to this guy. Have you heard this amazing singer? And people would say, Bill, we've been listening to him for 40 years, But that was that idea that because he got excited about it, you had to get excited about it too. So he took his friends sailing, he took them skiing, and he also brought them aboard for this movement he created. Really, there was nothing comparable to it. And I tell people this over and over again because they say, well, who's the new Bill Buckley? There is no new Bill Buckley. There was no old Bill Buckley. There was just Bill Buckley.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned you meet him when he's 65 years old. And in a lot of ways, when Bill Buckley's 65, he's kind of known as and these are my terms, the gatekeeper of conservatism, right? He's the individual who was able to chase out the birthers. He was the one that kind of was cool towards the end, the Randians, if you will, and excommunicated from the movement. He was able to take the more odious, dangerous elements of the right and sort of separate them. But it's difficult, I think, for especially someone of my age or younger to get in our head just how new the conservative movement is. Like in the when Bill Buckley's a young man, Alfred J. Knox, it's The Remnant, right? Or I think the original title for Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind was The Conservative Rout, almost a depiction of the end of conservatism, if you will. And this very clear awareness, at least among intellectual conservatives, that they were almost non-existent and pretty much in the minority and didn't have any political clout. And I think for that reason, it's difficult to truly appreciate the degree to which a William F. Buckley, being a late 20s, early 30s, was sort of what I think you depicted as the term, which is an oxymoron, a radical conservative, right? One that maybe, and maybe it's just because the guy got older, I get the sense he's sort of tempered with time, maybe as this ragtag group of people who had no, it's almost like, say, the libertarian movement today. It's easy to be radical when you have no real shot at power. Why not? But is that true? Was there a sense in which Buckley himself evolved with the movement out of necessity, or what did you observe there?
Everything you just said is 100% accurate. When Bill Buckley started National Review, he used the term radical conservative. It's in the very first issue, as you know. He says something like, this is a hard time. These are difficult times for radical conservatives. And I'm really glad you said the term is an oxymoron, because it is, right? Conservatives are supposed to preserve. Don't tell Russell Kirk, he's a radical when he is maintaining the traditions that go all the way back to John Adams and Disraeli and others even earlier. So I thought maybe Bill's a little off in his terminology. Then here's what happened. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. And I'll add, someone I think, I'll just say it flat out, is a genius, is the writer Mike Lind. I don't know if he's ever been on your show. He was Bill Buckley's last great protege turned apostate. Bill discovered him in the 80s when Mike Lind was in his 20s and said, and I've seen the correspondence, he just thought he was a genius. So we would talk about Mike. Well, and Mike would say to me, radical conservative doesn't really make any sense, just for the reasons you and I have just spelled out. Well, then in the course of writing this book, I had lunch with Henry Kissinger, who had been an early friend of Buckley's, which may surprise some people, went all the way back to the mid-50s. And Kissinger was describing the conservative spectrum, kind of the constellation of his time. And then he says, and of course you had the radical conservatives. I almost fell out of my seat. I thought, where is he getting that from? Then I realized, no, that's the term they used. And if you think about it in Buckley's terms, it sort of makes sense. Let's say you think liberals have totally dominated and taken over politics and culture, which was the case then. Some would say in some ways it still is, although we've seen a lot of changes. Well, the only way you're going to reverse that trend is to reach down into the roots of where the politics and culture are and yank them up. So you're a conservative and you're a radical. And then it made sense to me. And I'll add, Josh, that's one reason it took me so long to write this book. People say, how could it take you so many years? And I'll tell them.
You started in, what was it, 1998?
That's when I signed the contract. After he'd helped me, he'd been talk about gatekeeper. He was also a door opener. And he opened many doors for me when I was around back Whittaker Chambers, which is how I got to know him. And I felt I needed Buckley's blessing in that book. And again, he didn't care what my politics were. He just wanted someone to do a fair and full life of Whittaker Chambers. That's what he wanted me to do about him. Well, at that period, I didn't really, know Buckley all that well. I just knew that he was very important. But I could see he was looking for something different, that he wanted to be understood in this bigger and broader way. And so that's where I felt, okay, this is a guy who's doing something different from the other ideological people I've met. That is Buckley himself. And the kindnesses are just beyond description. We probably don't have time to get into them, but some of the favors he would do for you, you almost couldn't believe. But then I began to realize also, Buckley knew exactly what he was doing. When he uses a phrase like radical conservative, he knows exactly what he's doing when he says that he wants to shake things up. It's interesting. I was at Cornell University for a week and met some very young conservatives. I mean, a lot younger than you.
Oh, I'm not that young.
And these are campus conservatives, right? We're talking about like 19-year-olds. And when I told them National Review was in its day kind of a radical magazine, they couldn't believe it. They just think of it as purely establishment. And that was a lesson for me, because it helped me realize why some people reading the book now, younger people, are having a little trouble wrapping their minds around Buckley. They don't get just how radical his statements and arguments seem, but he brought such intellect and style to it, such a command of what they used to call the tradition with a capital T, that you thought, this is not a radical person. And as a person, he wasn't. And see, that's that paradox and contradictory thing in him that made him fun to be around, endlessly fascinating, but really hard to get to know as the kind of subject you write a book about. And that's why I couldn't really write it until after he died in 2008. And so I tell people, first of all, this book was actually written a little more quickly than you might think if you start from the time I signed the contract. But also, I'm not really that slow a writer. but I'm a really slow thinker. It takes me a really long time to figure out what I'm writing about. I'm not that smart. So it took me years to figure out what Bill Buckley meant by radical conservative. I'll add another thing here too, Josh, for writers, people who are or young, aspiring people who want to get into this kind of work. You get to a certain point where nobody can really explain things to you because you're in a place where other people are not. You're kind of alone. You become an autodidact. You have to teach yourself a lot of this stuff. And Bill Buckley was not giving it away. That's another thing. He was not a great interview. He was a great conversationalist, mainly because he was a great listener. And at the end of the interview, you realized he hasn't really told me that much. I've got to get into the archive. I've got to see the document. He's not telling me about all these other people he knew, these other aspects of his life. And that's where you become the detective. And with Bill Buckley, it was a very interesting trail to follow.
So you're mentioning these 19-year-old-ish, say, radical conservatives you see on college campuses. And this is kind of where I was wanting to almost end the conversation. But since you brought it up, I think maybe this is the best time to throw this out here. Bill Buckley, in my view, contains multitudes. He's, what is that famous quote of his? I'm sure you could quote it directly. I'd rather be ruled by the first 200 names in the Boston telephone directory than the faculty of Harvard Yard or something to that effect.
Very close. 2,000, but you
2,000,
basically
yes.
have it. Yeah.
2,000, yes. That gets played a lot as sort of an ode to, say, a populist mindset, right? Anti-establishment. On the other hand, there's a lot of ways in which I could forgive a 19-year-old radical conservative for looking at National Review and sort of the later iterations of William F. Buckley and saying, well, this guy that he spoke with such diction and this kind of almost imperceptible, well, it wasn't an imperceptible accent, but like the source of it was imperceptible, almost like he had such an odd voice and not snooty, don't get me wrong, but just sort of an elite, he eked almost an eliteness that was sort of the opposite of populism. And I bring that up because I think there is an open debate, and I'm curious what your views on this are. Were Buckley alive today, would he be spearheading the sort of alt-right or MAGA movement or Tucker Carlson's or any of these nationalist populist? Would he disavow all that? Where would he fall? Like, is he the godfather, if you will, of the latent, I'll say, Trumpist right?
Okay.
Or not?
That's the question, isn't it? And I think I'm asked it often, and I think about it often, and I thought about it in the later stages of the book. So I do not have a clear, decisive answer, and I can tell you his one living biological heir, his only biological heir, his son Christopher Buckley, the brilliant writer who really encouraged me to write this book, doesn't have an answer to it either. So here's some thoughts I'm going to throw out, and you and viewers and listeners can think about them. One way to look at it is, if we start with your idea of multitudes, that there are many different strands of conservatism and conservative thought and conservative action. And I'll add conservative feeling. Bill Buckley, for all his brilliance and that gigantic gold-plated vocabulary and the things you mentioned, the elevated diction and the Baroque sentences and all the rest, was very much a person of feeling. You could see in his, that's why he was great on TV, the way he would react to things, right? So you add all those things together, and then I would say, okay, let's look at the conservative movement today. Let's not worry about conservatism, which I think is a really difficult word to define. One of my...
Bill Buckley had a really difficult time defining that word.
He couldn't do it. He tried over and over again, and then he realized that was not his role. His role was to show you how to live and think like one, but not to set forth ideologies and doctrine. It's not what he did. But he did know what felt right to him, what made sense to him, what he agreed with, what he didn't. In other words, he's like most people. And if you look at the conservative constellation or today, what do you see? Well, President Trump sucks up a lot of oxygen. We get it. He's a powerfully dynamic, charismatic political figure. By far the largest of our century, and maybe even reaching back further than that. We get it. But look at some of the people around him. We've got J.D. Vance over here. You've got Mike Johnson over there. Mm-hmm. You have a lot of the writers at National Review who kind of came around on Trump after being critical of him. You have the cultural conservatives at publications like the Claremont Review of Books, edited by a protege of Bill Buckley, Charles Kessler. When Charles was almost exactly the same age as me, and he knew Bill, he worked for him in his late 20s. Or you look at Commentary Magazine and the neoconservatives, a pro-Israel group there. Well, they are not necessarily Trumpists, but they're on his side rather than the Democrats. You see all the different positions, or many of them, that Bill Buckley himself was aligned with. If you're going to be a movement that changes things, right, that attains real influence both in the culture and in politics, which, Josh, is so important with Bill Buckley. Really, the story I tell, if you think about it in this book, is of Bill Buckley as a cultural force as much as a political one. And when I say culture, it's the famous, Andrew Breitbart, right? Politics is downstream from culture. That's what Buckley got. It's very much alive with us today. And he would look around and he'd say, J.D. Vance, smart guy. Stephen Miller, smart guy. Do I want to go all the way with him? Well, maybe not. So here's a column I'm going to write saying, push back on this thing. Reagan wouldn't want you to do this, and we all like Ronald Reagan. In that sense, you're right. He did become a kind of gatekeeper. But that doesn't mean he's shutting people out all the time. It means he's making sure that the people who come through have enough in common with himself and other people he acknowledges conservatives, the lions and tigers and bears, that they can work together. So, he's an alliance builder and coalition builder. And so in that sense, I think Bill Buckley would say, all right, when Mike Wallace interviewed me in December of 1957, Mike Wallace, the very famous television interviewer, did an interview with the young Bill Buckley. And he said, are you a revolutionary? Bill Buckley said, yes, I am. I'm a counter-revolutionary. And he said, well, what do you mean by that? He said, well, to be a counter-revolutionary now in the late 1950s means to overturn the idea of the society. Notice he says society that came in with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. So does that mean Bill Buckley would look at what's happening now? Elon Musk rolling back some federal offices, Project 2025, looking hard at the so-called deep state. Would Buckley agree with a lot of that? He might.
I would be shocked if you felt like you had the definitive answer, right? It's always an unfair question to ask, hey, if such and so were alive today, how would they think or react to this? But I think it's interesting because he was such a central movement builder that there are so many variants of the right, let's say, that can claim him as their own. Some of them, I think, have to stretch the truth further than others.
Who do you think needs to stretch the truth furthest? Or is that putting you on the spot too much?
I might have to think through that a little bit. I do think there is a cult of personality around Donald Trump that masks a statism, a protectionism, if you will. There's parts of America First, different than the America First, say, that Buckley was involved in when he was younger, that I think is really more left of center and more collectivist than it is right of center. But I suspect you're probably right that were he alive today, he wouldn't just when we refer to Buckley as a gatekeeper, those are always the famous examples, right? Ayn Rand and the John Birch Society. But in reality, I think the way you depict it was far more accurate, which is that for the most part, it was more of a gentle nudging, if you will, right? Blunting the sharp edges on either side. And that's an excellent question. I'm not prepared to answer it. To throw out some names of here are the ones that are maybe stretching the truth the most. But I guess what I'm saying is, to the degree that Saving Elephants is about seeing the move of the right these days as an aberration or a departure from a limited government conservatism, while at the same time acknowledging that the right is at war culturally with the left. So it's a mixed bag, right? There are things that I think the Buckleyites, if you will. I mean, let's look at National Review today. They criticize Trump. They also praise him in certain regards. So it's probably a mixed bag.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up the statism, which, as you know, is a big word in the book, and one that was used by the original core at National Review. That's when they drew the parallels between the growing federal leviathan in the U.S. and totalitarian powers abroad, the Soviet Union in particular. That's what the famous fusionism was really about, that we can oppose a big government at home and abide by almost a more spiritual idea of a small government that emphasizes the virtue and freedom of its citizens, while also waging a pretty serious global conflict, right? That's going to cost a lot of money and will mean enlarging your central state. I found an essay he wrote in Commonweal, which is a Catholic liberal magazine, in the early 50s, where he spelled that out very directly. It's quoted in the book, and it really offended Murray Rothbard, who had been a friend of Buckley's in the 50s. Rothbard, the famous libertarian, self-proclaimed anarchist. He was really angry at Buckley when Buckley said, in order to preserve our freedom, we will have to militarize our own nation to fight the Soviets, because if we lose, if communism wins, then there's no possibility of freedom. To me, it seems pretty logical, but it was really controversial at the time. And someone on the right, like Paul Gottfried, will say to this day that the reason Bill Buckley drove the Birchers out was because they opposed the war in Vietnam, not for all these other reasons, calling Eisenhower a communist, things like that. Well, it's interesting to note that in 1952 or 3, when Frank Chodorow, the great libertarian, recruited Bill to start ISI, which was then called the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists.
Yeah, Russell Kirk took umbrage with that.
Yes, he did. And some others did as well. But so that's what they called it in the 50s. And of course, that group is still, that organization is going very strong today. When I speak in college campuses, it's often at events that they have sponsored. When I spoke at Yale University, which is 30 minutes from where I live, 35 minutes, they had 45 copies of the Buckley book there that ISI had purchased for them, which is exactly what they used to do 75 years ago. Well, in the early 60s, Buckley said, let's change the name. Let's take the individualist part out and instead change it to the name we now know, right? The Intercollegiate Studies, right? Institute,
yeah.
Which made it seem not so libertarian. But what happens after the fall of the Soviet Union? Communism is over. Bill Buckley brings out a book called Happy Days Are Here Again, Reflections of a Libertarian. In other words, once the Great Crusade had ended victoriously, which only two people thought could happen. One was Bill Buckley, and the other was one of his idols, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. They were the only ones who thought the Soviet Union would actually be defeated. So once that happens, what does Buckley do? He becomes a libertarian again. To me, that does not sound like consistency. I mean, inconsistency. It sounds like pragmatism. If, as you say, and I think you're right, you're always aware of where the left is, you're always positioning yourself against them, particularly when they're ascendant, and you're just trying to get some space for yourself, a little purchase in the argument. So you're positioning yourselves against them. Well, now that the war's been won, now that your great leader, political leader, Buckley's disciple, Ronald Reagan, is in office, you can revert, you can recover that earlier side of your politics. Listen, I think we could all use a little more of that now. Look at what's going on in the Democratic Party. You have centrist Democrats pleading with their own left to move back closer to the center because they think it's taking them out of the debate and it's harming them ideologically. That's just how you practice useful politics.
Pragmatism is a rare skill, it would seem, those who use it well. I think a deeper level of pragmatism is what I would call prudence, which adds the moral element to it as well. But they're both important, especially in politics. I wanted to ask, gosh, there's so many things I want to ask you, but I'm trying to limit it to what I think would be possibly the most beneficial for the listener. But I'm curious about this because National Review starts and declares war, of course, on the great conservative enemy, Dwight D. Eisenhower, right? Which today we're like, what the heck?
What was that about?
Of all the people we could go after. And I want to wed that to another kind of oddity, which is that Buckley was not only friendlier toward, but far more involved in Richard Nixon's administration. Presidency and later, no, maybe not in the early days, but when he becomes president, and of course, as you mentioned, he's good friends with Henry Kissinger. Now, in hindsight, we can look and look. It's fair to say that Dwight Eisenhower was not exactly a air quotes conservative president, but if you compare Eisenhower to Nixon, that's kind of an odd fit. I would assume the average person who sort of knew a little bit about Buckley would assume, well, he may have been okay with Eisenhower. Obviously, would have hated Nixon because Nixon, introduced price controls and I know this kind of, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but opens relations with Red China.
Which Buckley was outraged about. I mean,
completely right. And not outraged about.
Yeah.
Confused him for the rest of his life trying to piece that together. But up until that moment, let's say, help me understand this. Why would a young Buckley see Eisenhower as the great threat and then somehow Nixon as the great savior?
Well, it's a really good question. It's another one of these, slow thinking questions. I think one way to look at it, Josh, is to go back to the first election Bill Buckley really paid attention to, which was the election in 1940. And that's when the America First Committee, which he, as he called himself, was an ardent member of as a teenager when he was going to prep school in Dutchess County, New York, just a few miles from his home in Northwest Connecticut. And Buckley was the leader of the America First chapter. His entire family opposed the war. And much of the country did too. And I was pleased when my friend Dan McCarthy, who wrote about the book in The American Conservative, I think, said that I treated the America First movement fairly because I wanted to. We think about, anti-Semitism and all those. It was a student movement. It was a student anti-war movement in its origins. And of course, Buckley was a great admirer of Charles Lindbergh. Many people were. Again, this is, 80 years ago. Well, when the Republican Party's leaders, its ideological leaders, and its grassroots support, and in those days, much of it was in the Midwest. Later it shifted to what another Buckley protege, Kevin Phillips, called the Sun Belt, very famous term, but that hadn't been coined yet. And the great conservatives were in the Midwest. Lindbergh was in the Midwest. He was from Minnesota. Robert Taft was from Ohio. That's where the figures were from. And either Taft or Arthur Vandenberg from Michigan, senator, who was an isolationist. An isolationist was not an insult in those days.
Right.
It was just the term people used to describe themselves very proudly. Or Thomas Dewey, who was the governor of New York, but really came from Michigan. They were all either opposed to intervention in World War II or on the fence. But
you probably mentioned this is all pre-Pearl Harbor.
Very good point. This is pre-Pearl Harbor. This is 1940. Remember, Pearl Harbor came at the very end of 41. So this is 1939 through early 1941, the key years for the American First Committee. Well, and movement, who gets the nomination? It's none of those guys. The Eastern press, you sound like a conspiracy nut when you say it, except it happened to be true. Henry Luce, the publisher of Time magazine, and the Whitney family, who were the editors and publishers of the Herald Tribune, which was the great establishment Republican newspaper in New York, the equal of the New York Times for kind of moderate Republicans. They handpicked their own candidate. And that was Wendell Willkie, who again came from the Midwest, but made a lot of money in Wall Street. And he was opposed to the New Deal, but he was very much pro-intervention. So if you're a conservative, an ideological, torch-bearing conservative, your own party has completely let you down. What they call the kingmakers, Phyllis Schlafly's famous book, A Choice Not an Echo, had just reached in and put somebody in charge. So that's what happened, and it gave him the nomination. That's what happened in 1940. Flash forward to 1952. Bob Taft still wants to be president, senator from Ohio. Dewey's day is done. He's been nominated a couple of times. But Taft and Douglas MacArthur, the World War II hero, very much an isolationist, kind of what you'd call a unilateralist. They're the dominant voices in the party. Who gets the nomination? It's Eisenhower, whom the Democrats had offered the nomination to in 1948. When Harry Truman thought he might not even run, he was so unpopular, he said to Eisenhower, "I'll hand it over to you." So that made Republicans think, well, who is this guy? He's an interloper. It's interesting. I wrote a piece in the New York Times 2016, right before the convention, saying, you could apply some of that to Donald Trump as well. Here's another guy who comes from outside the party. He's not an ideological conservative. He doesn't have an institutional history with the movement. Who is this guy exactly? And maybe he'll shake things up, which of course he ended up doing. Well, so if you were part of that really dedicated ideological part of the movement and leading it, as Buckley is now starting to do in his late 20s, and they bring out Eisenhower, you think, here we go again. Mm-hmm. We're not being given our choice. Eisenhower's a big UN guy. Remember, he'd been the Supreme Allied Commander and also the head of NATO troops. All that's very contemporary terms, very globalist. Buckley and company were anti-communist. They weren't globalist in the same way. That's how the term unilateralist got invented. It meant they were anti-communist, but we're going to do it our way. We'll build our weapons. We'll control our armies. The UN isn't going to tell us what to do. All these things are incredibly relevant right now. Mm-hmm. But that's why they could look at Eisenhower and say, this is a Trojan horse. This is somebody who's being put before the public, but talk about air quotes, because he's electable, the way Wendell Willkie was supposed to be electable. And all Eisenhower is likely to do is perpetuate the New Deal. He might be a conservative, but he's not a radical conservative. He's not going to undo what Franklin Roosevelt did. He's going to kind of keep it in place. And if you saw what Roosevelt did, if you saw that as an extreme attack from the left, you say Eisenhower is almost worse than a Democrat because he's calling himself a conservative and putting his stamp on all this radicalism. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying I think that's true. I'm telling you that's what Bill Buckley thought and said. When I sent the pages off to one of my early readers of the book, Gary Wills, the great protege of Buckley, who then became an apostate, one thing he said to me, well, you got one thing right. They all hated Eisenhower. It wasn't just Buckley. Everybody at National, they wanted to denounce him and read him out of the party and all these things. And then later, Buckley came around. And he said, well, Eisenhower's a pretty good president. Then when you get to Nixon, the reason they distrusted him at first was because he'd been Eisenhower's vice president. Mm-hmm. When Nixon had a great anti-communist credential, he was the guy who got Alger Hiss, who was able to make the one real anti-communist enemies within case stick. And Buckley's mentor and idol, Whittaker Chambers, loved Nixon. He thought Nixon had protected him and saved him.
If I'm not mistaken, that was some of the hurt feelings between Chambers and Buckley, was the way some of Buckley's responses to embarrass Nixon, if you will, really upset Chambers.
That's why he quit National Review. You're absolutely right. And, it's so interesting you bring that up, because so few people do. To me, that's some of the most interesting stuff in the life and in the book. It was all these friendships that are breaking apart. Although Buckley, you'll notice, remained personally friends with Chambers. That was really important to him. He somebody told me he hugged his friends close, and that's when he set this politics aside, and but Chambers felt, leading up to the 1960 election, that Nixon deserved the nomination. National Review wouldn't even endorse him. They didn't endorse him after he got the nomination, and that really bothered Chambers. And so he said, I can't be a part of this. He was afraid they were going to go off and start a third party. That's what, he called it crackpottery, He was afraid. And Buckley had a little bit of that when he was starting out. A lot of young people do. We're seeing it in politics now. You got some of the MAGA crowd, suddenly disillusioned. And, I go talk to young people on campuses and they say, well, you think Tucker Carlson might be the new leader of the movement? And these are like students at Yale, right? I mean, I'm not talking about like people who aren't smart and keeping up with things.
Wow. And there, once again, there's so much we could talk about here. I'm having to condense your near 900-page book down. I wanted to turn here. I don't want too much time to pass without turning towards, I'm just going to say, criticisms of your work, because I want you to have an opportunity to respond to these. And I don't think anything I'm going to say you're going to be surprised by. I'm sure you've heard it 1,000 times, because you have this very unique lane of you yourself not being part of the conservative mold or tradition, yet writing about these great conservative figures like William F. Buckley and Whittaker Chambers. Your Chambers book was almost roundly praised, so far as I could tell, by conservative thought leaders who thought it was just an incredibly well done book. And I listened to Matthew Continetti, Rick Lowry, Stephen Hayward, who had kind of given some reviews, if you will, of your work. And I say that because I broadly think the critiques could be boiled down to two. And so I wanted to go through each of them. And ironically, both of them start with the notion that your 900 pages is too short.
I take that as a compliment.
Right. It's like, maybe it should have been longer. So the first one was, and this is maybe I'll say more a soft criticism. It's not so much this is wrong. It's more of a warning of, if you're going to read this book, here's what you won't encounter as much as one might presume. And that is, and I think it was Matthew Continetti who said this, Sam Tanenhaus gets anti-communism very well. He does not necessarily get intellectual conservatism. And so as you read this book, he says, you're not going to get really in-depth prose about the exact nature of Frank Meyer's fusionism and what Buckley's imprints of that were, or how he was molded by it, or Harry Joffe, rather, schooling Buckley on disavowing his anti-Lincolnism and better understanding the role Lincoln played in the American movement. And I could go on and on and on, but I guess that being the first is that it's almost some of those individuals, and of course, in all fairness, Matthew Continetti, that he eats, lives, breathes, and eats conservative intellectualism. I guess I do to a certain extent myself, not nearly as much as he does. But is that a fair observation? Is this book not attempting to be, say, an intellectual understanding of Buckley and how he worked within the movement? Obviously, it's in the book. I'm not saying it's vacant. But was your aim different than that?
Yes, it was. And you've put it very well and very thoughtfully. And I thought Matt and some others have also put it quite thoughtfully. Look, Matt wrote his own very good book that lays out a lot of the arguments. And no, that's not the book I wanted to write. That it's not the book Bill Buckley wanted me to write. He wanted a picture of the life. He believed, it's my understanding, that his own reputation would be best presented and preserved by someone who captured his life in motion, because that's how he lived it. When I would talk to Kathy, my wife, who got to know Bill very well, we spent a lot of time with him. She said, you have to keep this light and it has to move quickly, because that's what Bill Buckley was like. Well, you remember what I think is probably his most wonderful book, I wish it was being talked about a little more, is that great memoir he wrote, Cruising Speed. It was published in 1971, which covers, amazingly, 1 week in his life. And
I think Matthew Continetti says that's his favorite Buckley book.
Oh, I think most people say it is. And I'm sure Matt knows, and I have a feeling you know too, what Buckley says in the last page. He says, I can't do that. I don't think the way Michael Oakeshott does. I don't argue the way James Burnham does. If you want to read those arguments, they'll give them to you. But I, Bill Buckley, don't do that. Instead, Buckley had a phrase. It's a little stilted for him because he was normally a wonderful phrase maker. He came up with it when he was younger and wrote his first real idea book, Up From Liberalism. He had a phrase called the conservative demonstration. And what he meant by that was it was hard for conservatives to make people see, to give them an example of what it would be to be a conservative rather than just a critic of liberalism. And what I realized in my slow thinking way that Bill Buckley was saying in Cruising Speed, and George Will agreed with me about this when I interviewed him for the book, is that book is the conservative demonstration. The demonstration, what Bill Buckley does in the course of a week, all the people he talks to or meets, the wonderful young people he debates with at Yale, or when he throws the big party for National Review at Tavern on the Green and gets on the phone with the pianist and tells him exactly what Bach pieces he wants him to play. Or he's flying from interview to another, or reminiscing about his famous debate with James Baldwin. That's the Bill Buckley who could attract so many people to the ideas he did not originate or even elaborate so much as he espoused and lived out. And so that's the way to I think, to treat Bill Buckley, to take him on those terms, because that was his great contribution. I'm a little surprised when I use a phrase, or a number of phrases I've used. They're brought up often in reviews, both in favorable ones and unfavorable ones, where I say he was a kind of performing ideologue. That's not to put him down. That's to show the genius of the performance. In other words, he took the idea of being a very ideological person and showed people how you could do that in an attractive way. That's the performance. Or I say he was an intellectual entrepreneur. Somebody told me they really like that phrase. Well, Barry Weiss wouldn't be embarrassed to be called an intellectual entrepreneur. In fact, that's what George Will called her. That's an important thing to do. Also, I say, this one really surprised me that people took his criticism. When I said Bill Buckley was one of the best writers on the right. He was not the best or deepest thinker, but he was the movement's most articulate voice. And somehow people have taken that to be an insult. I wish somebody would say, I'm the most articulate voice writing biography right now. I would not consider that an insult. So I think what I'm sensing, Josh, and I just feel we can talk about these things because I haven't brought them up much. I think there's a deeper objection to the book that's coming from a new, I'll call them the Gen X conservatives. That's Rich's group and Matt's group. People who are younger than me.
Technically, Matthew Continetti isn't. He's right between Gen X and Millennial. I asked him that. He's right between there. He doesn't exactly identify with Gen X. I know what you mean. Zennial, I think you said. Is it 81 or 80? I can't remember when.
Okay, then he would be right. He'd just be a millennial.
Just barely.
Just barely. Ross Douthat, born 1979, is in that group.
Yeah.
I think for that group, what they were surprised by was that there's not more on them in the book. And somebody who's a friend of mine, very respected conservative writer and intellectual, who read the book and liked it, told me and said to others that there seems to be, that some people were kind of, his term is memory hold, from Orwell's 1984. And I get that. That. They're thinking, well, if you're going to tell the story of Bill Buckley, really, you're not going to talk about the Rich Lowry era? You're not going to talk about the big debates in the 90s. There's a little on it with Pat Buchanan and Bill's quarrel with Mike Lind. And I really thought, and maybe this is where my liberal side comes in, which, I don't pretend I don't have. I thought the story was more about the apostates than it was about the acolytes. In other words, I knew Bill Buckley pretty well, actually very well. And nothing was more crushing to him personally than when Gary Wills left the fold.
Mm-hmm.
Because he was, in Bill's opinion, Wilmore Kendall said, Gary Wills is a genius. I have the letter where he says it. They thought, Jim Burnham, they thought Wills was a true intellectual prodigy. And when he broke away, that was a huge loss for National Review, from which they never recovered. It was as important in its way as Goldwater's defeat. It was a huge, crushing moment. That's partly because of the personal feeling Buckley had for him. That's the story I'm really telling. So if you're a man who prizes friendships, prizes his own remarkable talent that Bill had for seeing, spotting, fresh voices, Joan Didion writing for National Review, finding these extraordinary writers. That was when Bill Buckley was a figure in New York. And he was very proud of that Joan Didion's writing for him, and John Leonard, who had the job well before me that I later did as editor of the New York Times Book Review, had been discovered by Bill when he was 19 years old and a Harvard dropout. Bill thought John might be the next Bill Buckley. And John Leonard was kind of on the left. And those stories, to me, in a human sense, got closer to where Bill Buckley was. So I would never say Matt or Ramesh or other people I really respect, Jonah Goldberg, that they're wrong to say that there could be a biography of Bill Buckley with a lot more of that in it. Yeah. It was, it's as a storyteller, that did not feel as rich to me, that material.
And in your response, you partially, I think, anticipate what I mentioned. There were two.
Yeah.
The second critique, and this probably goes by a lot of different names, but I'll try to define it as this. And I actually did the math. A lot of people talk, again, your 900 pages is not, and I say 900, it's actually, what is it, 860
50,
plus the notes,
like
I think, gets us closer to 900.
That's right.
I did the
100
math.
pages of notes. Yeah.
Right. 811 pages in, we finally get to Ronald Reagan. 94% of the book up until that, so the last 6% is sort of the era that would depict a lot of, Matthew Cotton, a lot of these Gen Xers, if you will, their day and on the Reagan Revolution, the 90s, the battles there. And that, it's not so much, I think people are saying they're complaining. It's not so much that that's wrong. It's like everybody was, hey, it goes almost at this neck break speed at the end. Rather, what they're saying is there seems to be a lack of balance there, that if you go back in what was in those previous 800 pages, it is a deep dive over and over and over of the various ways in which William F. Buckley and his family and those around him interacted with, quite frankly, awful people on the right who had relatively light or just outright racist pro-Jim Crow segregationist views. And before I ask anything further, I want to say here, I am very aware of the fact that the history of racism and the segregationist views and the American right is a twisted and miserable and complex history, one that I think the only way to truly evolve out of that is to acknowledge, right, and to work through. There also, and I'm not accusing you of this, don't misunderstand, but there is also, I think, a tendency on the left to essentially boil conservatism down to nothing but racism. That all this intellectual pursuit is just sort of window dressing for, in reality, it's just segregation. And so I think that is the criticism that's often expressed, is that by focusing so much on it, it kind of gives voice to those who would say, well, there's nothing here. Other than just sort of those who were hearkening back to an older, say, South that never actually existed. And so I just want to give you an opportunity to express, is that a fair critique? Do you think that is missing the point, or what would you say to that?
Well, I would say it's a little off in one sense. There's a lot on Reagan before he was elected president. Because
that's fair. That's totally fair.
Well, it's true. I mean, one of the crucial chapters in the book, one of the most important, is when Bill Buckley essentially chose Richard Nixon over Ronald Reagan in 1968. That's a huge moment in the history of American conservatism.
I actually did not know that until I was genuinely shocked that happened.
And Bill Rusher never really forgave him for it, because Rusher and company didn't like Nixon. Brent Bozell wrote a famous attack on Buckley that's in the book for having aligned himself with Nixon in 1968. And the argument was that Bill Buckley's gone establishment. This is the establishment Republican. I happen to think Buckley was making very shrewd and sensible call. Everyone knew Nixon was a criminal at that point, the criminal he later became. So there I'll say, no, Reagan is very much in the book. Reagan is there as Buckley's disciple. But here's what happened, as you know, because you read it. Once Reagan became elected in some way in 1980, takes office after really humiliating Bill Buckley in a very public way that I'm a little surprised isn't being talked about a little more, because it's there. And I even have, the clinching evidence, which had never been found before, that when Reagan ignored, he snubbed Buckley's plea with him to be the guest of honor at the 25th anniversary of National Review. Big blowout party with 60 Minutes there with their cameras and every famous political intellectual in America in the room, and Reagan doesn't show up. I produced the goods. You look at my notes, that Reagan's calendar was empty that day. He deliberately chose not to do that. Okay. Well, I'm a little surprised that people who think I'm so tough on Bill Buckley don't feel my disappointment with him that Reagan let him down in that way, that I'm Bill Buckley's advocate there. I haven't heard a single conservative point that out. And that Buckley rescued the event by giving this glorious tribute to James Burnham in front of that audience, and thereby asserting the importance, maybe even the primacy, of the intellectual over the political, air quotes, actor. Show me the conservative who's acknowledged that that's in that book. That's not my problem. That's their problem. So I'll add another thing to that, which is I don't write. I'm going to step back a little ways. If you look at a recent essay, which I was not aware of, by James Fallows, who's one of our most respected political writers for many, many years now, historian and writer, he says this book is better than Robert Caro's, than all of Robert Caro's, for the reasons that conservatives are missing, that I show these things the Buckley and Buckley family did. And without sacrificing any respect or sympathy for Buckley himself. So to my mind, when conservatives object to seeing a carefully researched, closely, narratively presented story of the Buckley's life in South Carolina, look at us now. We're giving it 30 seconds in this. You should know better than that. Let me say that to you directly. You should know better than that. It's not just a matter of saying whether or not they're all racist. No, this is the history of the family. This is the history the movement came out of. Buckley's a cultural Southerner. He's not just defending Jim Crow. He's saying that Yale shouldn't have a dance where black and white people, are in the same room together. No, let's be honest about this, And that informed, educated conservatives, intellectuals on the right can't accept the truth of that history except to squeeze it into 2 sentences? Who's got the problem there? I'll tell you, it's not me.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
Okay, people, here's the deal. I had an awesome conversation with Sam Tanenhaus. And that conversation went longer than what you just heard. Unfortunately, right about this time, we began having some very frustrating audio issues, and the recording from this point onward was just not salvageable. I wanted to break in and explain that at the end of this recording because where it ends, it kind of sounds like Sam Tanenhaus got very upset and just hung up the call. I assure you that did not happen. We had a great conversation, asked him a couple more questions after this, and then we closed on a much cheerier note. I did want to clear one thing up briefly. When I had set up my question, listened back to it, I realized I'd made a mistake. Or not a mistake so much, I said something in a way that was misleading. I mentioned that the last 6% of the book had to do with Ronald Reagan and kind of the period of the 1980s onward. Ronald Reagan is in this biography from about the midpoint onward. Reagan was a very important figure on the right long before he became president of the United States, and he had a close relationship with William F. Buckley, and certainly Sam Tanenhaus does a good job sketching that out throughout his biography. What I was referring to was when Reagan ascends to the presidency, when conservatism is in a sense in its ascendancy in the 1980s. By the time we get there in the biography, we've already went through 94% of it. Now, since Sam is not on this side of the recording to defend his position any further, I'm not going to give any retort. I will just say this. If, in fact, you've left this conversation wondering, well, I'm kind of curious what these conservative critics had in mind when they were saying that Tanenhaus focuses too much on the racial aspect of William F. Buckley's life. Well, I have a suggestion I think Sam would be perfectly happy with, which is you should probably just go buy the book and read it. And then you can go back and listen to the conversation we had and decide for yourself whether or not the argument of the critics hold water or whether or not Sam's response is the more persuasive. But if you take conservatism seriously, you really should read a book like Sam's to understand William F. Buckley, because you really don't understand American conservatism without having at least some cursory knowledge of William F. Buckley. And Sam's book does much more than a cursory knowledge. He really takes a deep dive, and for that, it's well worth reading. Again, as a reminder, I would love to have you join us for the live stream panel discussion on Sunday, November the 23rd at 7 p.m. Central Time or 8 p.m. Eastern Time. I'll have links in the show notes, of course, of how you can join us for that live stream as we continue the conversation about the life and legacy of this remarkable individual, William F. Buckley.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.